Okay, welcome everyone. Now that our panelists are also here and also our participants, I see a quite high number of participants. So welcome everyone. Let us start our webinar. Um, so this is a zooming in on migration and asylum webinar series, which draws upon the work of the research teams involved in different H2026 projects and their respective findings. These projects are UDNIGO, Migrants, Magic, and Traffic. And then this webinar series is actually taking place on a monthly basis since June 2020. This is our ninth webinar, ensuring comparability in cross-national research on migration. I'm Ayşen Üstübici from Koç University, Istanbul. I'm part of Migrants, but also UDNIGO, and I will be moderating the session. So before we start the discussion, I would like to give some logistical information for our participants, some technical instructions. You will see that in the webinar, there is a Q&A box. If you have questions, please feel free to write your questions there and we will address them at the end. And also, there's a chat box, but this is not for questions, but some information can be also sent by the panelists through the chat box. And note that this series is actually recorded and live stream on YouTube. So if you are following us on the YouTube channel, it is also possible to put your questions there and they will be directed to me. And then at the same time, please free, like as we go along with presentations, please feel free to put your questions in both platforms. And then, as I said, we will address them towards the end. So today we have three presenters representing three different currently running H2020 projects, Magic, Traffic, and Migrants. These projects, along with their focus on migration governance, they also involve data collection, very extensive data collection in various contexts at various levels using different approaches to data. And the experiences that have been gathered from these projects actually provide us a fruitful avenue to discuss research design, particularly the use of comparative methods in large projects. And that is sort of the main motivation that shaped the structure of our panel today. So we have three presenters, as I said. Let me briefly present each of them, and then we can move on to the presentations. First, we will start with Dr. Lea Müller-Funk, who's a research fellow at GIGA, German Institute of Global Area Studies, and a researcher of the MAGIC project. The project, the full name is Migration Governance and Asylum Crises in plural, and it is conducting a comparative multi-level analysis of the dynamics of South-South migration flows in key sending regions of migration to the EU. Then we will move on to Benjamin Etzold's presentation. Benjamin is a senior researcher at the Peace and Conflict Studies Center at BICC and the scientific coordinator of the Traffic project. Traffic, the transnational figurations of displacement, investigates long-standing displacement situations at multiple sites in Asia, Africa, and Europe, and analyzes options to improve displaced people's lives. Then we have a third presenter, Dr. Marta Biwant Erdal, research professor in migration studies at the Peace Research Institute also. And she is also the coordinator of a work package in Migrants project, aligning migration management and migration development nexus, the full name of the project. And Migrants carries out mixed method data collection in 25 local areas across 10 countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So, in the first part of our webinar, while telling about their research design and field experience, I also invite the speakers to reflect on the overarching questions that have motivated the organization of this webinar today, regarding the challenges as well as opportunities of the research design. I think this was already written in the invitation to this webinar, but let me sort of remind you for audience what these questions were. So one of these questions is that at the level of research design, what are the feasible and meaningful units of comparison, particularly in migration research? And in the context of data collection, how can the desire for comparability best be balanced with data collection that is attuned to local contexts? And are the challenges, solutions different for qualitative versus the quantitative methodologies? And the implications of international collaboration between teams and individuals with different types of ties to the groups and locations that are studied. So based on these sort of motivating questions, let us move on, let us turn to our presenters. So first, our first presenter, as I said, is Dr. Leo Miller-Funk from the MAGIC project. So typically, we will have 10 minutes for each presentation, then we will continue with a moderated Q&A session, and then in our last 20, 30 minutes or so, we will turn to Q&A from the audience. So thank you so much. I thank everyone for organizing this and also for inviting me as moderator. And Leah, floor is yours. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here today, despite the general Zoom fatigue. I think it's a really great effort of the Zooming in webinar series to bring together Horizon 2020 projects working on migration and discuss challenges, solutions, and also analysis. And thank you also to the Migrants team for organizing the session. So I will start by giving a brief overview of what we are doing in work package Comparing Crisis, which is one of the 8 work packages of the MAGIC project, which I'm part of, and then reflect on challenges and possible solutions for comparative research in conflict countries and neighboring countries of conflict countries. The MAGIC project overall seeks to assess how migration governance has been influenced by the recent refugee crisis and how crises at large shape policy responses on migration. And the project aims at addressing 3 biases: a securitization bias, which considers migration mainly as a security risk; a northern bias, which tends to ignore the importance of south-south migration flows; and a historical bias, which considers migration as exceptional and critical. So the 8 work packages are organized along the 2 dimensions of time and space. The work package 4, called Comparing Crisis, conducts a comparative analysis of migration governance and the dynamics of South-South migration flows in 3 key sending regions of migration to the EU: the Middle East, North Africa, and Horn of Africa. And we basically try to understand 2 things. First of all, what is a migration crisis in our 3 research regions, and what drives forced migration governance, and how do efforts to control and regulate movement figure in negotiations between state and non-state actors. So in work package 4, we have a comparative area perspective with intra-regional and cross-regional comparisons. And how we are structuring our work is that we are working on 6 case studies as a team in work package 4. So one case study focuses on forced migration governance in Tunisia in times of turmoil, in Algeria and Libya. So this is a comparison within one country across time. A second case study looks into internal displacement following environmental crisis in Ethiopia and Syria, which is a cross-regional comparison with one historical and one contemporary case study. The third case study focuses on forced migration governance towards Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Jordan. It's an intra-regional comparison while also considering the role of the local level / municipalities. The fourth case study looks into how regimes deal with their own displaced population in times of war. So it's a cross-regional comparison between Libya and Syria. Case study 5 is a cross-regional comparison and examines how European migration deals have been perceived and framed in national media in Tunisia and Turkey. And the sixth case study is a bit apart, as it is a single case study and looks into European externalization practices in Niger and how they affect different groups of migrants and including Nigerian migrants who are not necessarily targeted as such by law 36, which criminalizes transit migration through Niger. So in the following, I will focus on the challenges of data collection and our approach taken for one of the case studies I'm currently working on with my colleague Christiane Fröhlich at GIGA. As I said, it is a cross-regional comparison where we want to understand how war countries such as Libya and Syria control and regulate the internal and external movement of their own population. The data collection was very challenging, and data we use was partly collected in the frame of MAGIC, but we also use qualitative data from previous projects, my previous Marie Curie project, and another project hosted at GIGA. So when we look at challenges we faced, one of the questions sent ahead of the webinar focused on units of comparison. So of course, we were also faced with the question of which unit of comparison to use in the context of political fragmentation and different centers of political control across the two countries. A second question we faced was, should we use nationality as a selection criteria for interviews with forced migrants, given that it might exclude minority groups which have been discriminated by citizenship legislation? And thirdly, how to deal with security and travel restrictions, as we cannot travel to Syria and Libya ourselves, and also traveling across the country can be too dangerous for local researchers. And in general, how to ensure the safety of the research team, also of local research assistants in neighboring countries, where we have worked with displaced Syrians in Lebanon, who at least partly lived in the context of legal vulnerability. Then also moral and practical obstacles when engaging with certain political actors, especially when it comes to Syria. And then we were also faced with different levels of previous research experiences, networks, and language skills. And finally, COVID-19 added another layer of complexity, as much of the data collection was collected throughout 2020, which meant that traveling became impossible for me and Christiane. It also led to stronger local cooperation, so more data collection was done through local research assistants than previously planned, with coordination from afar. We also had to follow, of course, local COVID-19 regulations, which also delayed data collection. And in general, much more data collection was done online than previously planned. And not being able to travel hindered also building new social networks and gain local knowledge, and also possibilities to conduct participant observations. And the fact that expert interviews were mostly conducted online meant that data collection took longer and access to some groups was more difficult, especially interviewees with people working in ministries and at the local level. So apart from the pandemic, these challenges are not so different from challenges I faced during my Marie Curie project, which was a mixed methods project. But of course, the objective to try to reach a representative survey complicates matter further, as fieldwork is much more visible if it is a large-scale survey conducted face-to-face, and there are also fewer possibilities to remain invisible when conducting fieldwork. So given the ethical and security concerns involved, we opted for a purely qualitative research design from the very beginning. So what were the possible solutions and the approach we took? First of all, we took forced migrants as a starting point to understand not only their lived reality, but also how policy is implemented and also informal practices. We collaborated with displaced Libyans and Syrians inside and outside the country for data collection, and conducted qualitative interviews with returnees, internally displaced and immobile people in conflict countries, and externally displaced people in one neighboring country, which was Lebanon in the case of Syria, and Tunisia in the case of Libya. We also decided not to take nationality as a selection criterion, but rather place of birth and current and previous place of residence to account for minorities who have been excluded from citizenship, such as Kurds in Syria and also some Black minorities in Libya. And we complemented these interviews with expert interviews with national political actors on different levels, representatives of international organizations, and international and local NGOs. When it comes to the units of comparison, we did not aim for representativity on the national level, but took a space-based approach, focusing on urban displacement. In conflict countries, we tried to cover main regions under different political control. So, for example, East and West in Benghazi, focusing on East and West in Libya, focusing on Benghazi and Tripoli, and regime and anti-regime areas in Syria, focusing on Damascus, Aleppo, and Idlib. On the other hand, the choice of our field sites in Libya and Syria also clearly reflects our strategy to mitigate risks, and reflects where we and our research assistants had social networks, because we only interviewed people within wider social networks and to reduce risks. And we attempted to cover regions we didn't have access to through interviews with people from those regions who fled to Tunisia and Libya. The choice of field sites in Tunisia and Lebanon was to conduct data in the capital city and a border city to understand how movement is controlled and regulated at the border. So here you can basically see the locations where we did field work in both countries. And to sum up, when we look at the collected data, we see, of course, clear limitations of our data. Our data reflects, on the one hand, our access to different localities based on personal networks of research team members and our previous research experience, and is not representative at the national level. Our data also reflects the mobility restrictions before and during COVID-19. We also changed some field sites because we could not, for example, travel to Medellin in Tunisia, so we changed Medellin to Sfax, for example. And our expert interviews have also a bias towards experts in international organizations and NGOs, as it was extremely difficult to interview national political actors and especially people at the local level from afar during the pandemic. I'm happy to discuss how these limitations also affect comparability at large later in the Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Leah, also for keeping with the time. So let us move to our second presenter, Benjamin Etzold from Traffic Project. Benjamin is going to talk about this large-scale survey that have been conducted in this context with displaced population. Leah, can you stop sharing your screen? Yes, yeah. Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I hope you can see my screen now. So let me keep the general introduction of traffic, transnational figurations of displacement rather short. Sort of the overarching aim of our project is to find out more about protracted displacement situations and to contribute to developing solutions to such difficult circumstances in which displaced people find themselves after they have initially been displaced. And particularly focus that we have in the project is on the social networks in which displaced people are embedded. And we're trying to explore the role that local, translocal, and transnational networks, the connectivity, and people's mobilities, what roles these play towards finding solutions and towards improving the situations of those who have been displaced. We are conducting research in several regions. We're focusing on people who have been displaced from Afghanistan, from Syria, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and from Eritrea, but also include in our broad sample other people who had to flee and find themselves in our focal countries that are listed here on the right side of the slide. So we conducted research in Congo, Ethiopia, Jordan, Pakistan, Italy, Greece, Germany, and some other countries as well. So the question was raised to us sort of at the level of the research design: what are feasible and meaningful units of comparison? There's quite a, in general and in migration research, there's quite a particular focus of traffic. That's why we call the project transnational figurations of displacement. And this is the term figuration. A figuration is a term coined by the sociologist Norbert Elias to describe interdependent social relations. It is a concept that can be applied at quite different scales of analysis, from the household and an extended family, a neighborhood, a local community, up to even a city or a nation state. By focusing on transnational figurations of displacement, we try to understand the broader social constellations in which displaced people are embedded, and we argue that the most crucial social units then can often not be found at one place only, but that they stretch across a multitude of places and often across borders. And then the social relations of the displaced thus constitute a transnational space that either existed prior to displacement and was changed thereafter, or that was formed due to the displacement and on the move. So such a design has, of course, implications on the units of analysis, so to speak. So in most of our interviews, we have a mixed methods approach, trying to complement qualitative research methods with quantitative methods. In most of our interviews, we still conducted interviews with individuals and try to understand the dependency relations that shape their current situation from their own perspective, and thereby pursue something like the egocentric network analysis, an approach we took in hundreds of semi-structured and biographic interviews across our study regions. In few cases, we also spoke with several members of the family, sometimes together, sometimes quite different places, and could thereby understand the translocal relations, or in some cases transnational relations, in which the families live and how they were transformed under conditions of displacement, for instance. Yet, this has also been a particular challenge in our research. Conducting interviews with members of the same family living in different places has been extremely difficult to be realized in practice. At another scale, we conducted focus group discussions at multiple study sites, for instance, with younger women who had fled from Syria to Ramta in northern Jordan, and they helped us to better comprehend the uniqueness of situations or communalities in the experiences of displacement that people faced. As a particular format, we also organized multi-stakeholder community consultations, for instance, in Bukavu, a city in eastern Congo, where both IDPs and longer established residents living in neighborhoods together came together to discuss the issues, the challenges that they face on a daily basis. And last but not least, we're complementing these insights with expert interviews and stakeholder meetings in order to get a more comprehensive overview of local, translocal, and transnational figurations in the context of protracted displacement, and then in particular how policies, states, humanitarian organizations, how they provide structures and governance frames through which displaced people then navigate, and how these things change over time. To cut it short, so in general, the approach is based on the idea of triangulation, trying to tap many different units of analysis in order to develop a comprehensive understanding of the everyday lives, social relations, and the networks of displaced people, and then how these social dependencies and indeed power structures shape experiences of protracted displacement, or what we can learn from them to find ways out of them. So in the context of data collection and the question of comparability, the question was posed to us by Asian, sort of how we can best balance a generic approach with the attuning concept to local contexts. Sort of I can answer that on 4 different levels. First, it's on the level of the research teams. So in all countries where we conducted our empirical research, colleagues work closely together. Colleagues who know the local context very well, who have been working in the region for many years, and then we either who have done previous research there or who are doing advisory advocacy work and legal counseling for displaced people. And I think thereby sort of with working together in teams, for instance, from BIC with colleagues from Addis Ababa University, or from our colleague CMI working together with Yarmouk University or so, I think this enabled us already to attune our general design to the local context. Then in terms of the research design, we have some focal themes for empirical research that you can read here. And for each of these themes, we developed a set of key questions and wrote them down in a project internal methodology handbook. And we asked them, the researchers who had been involved in the project, well, to address these questions in their local research. And of course, bearing in mind that these questions have to be adjusted to the local context, which is, of course, very easily done in qualitative research when you sit together with displaced people and, you know, try to understand it more from their perspectives. But adjusting questions, there's a lot of more complexity in a larger comparative survey, so you can't easily change questions. Nonetheless, sort of structuring our research along these themes and writing down findings in protocols, for instance, along these 5 themes, seem to work quite well for most of our colleagues, and well, for others, it made it a bit less intuitive. So in the presentation of our research findings, you just see the cover of our most recent working papers from Congo, Ethiopia, and Jordan. We also try to organize it along these themes. And these organizing presentation of the findings along the themes is like a first step towards a comparative analysis of our findings across our study sites. Yeah, but we left the space for the researchers to lay out like cross-cutting findings that go beyond our narrow themes, to point, for instance, to gender dimensions of protractedness or questions of ethnicity or belongings. For the survey data, we are currently at a stage sort of where we are analyzing the data, and the original aim was that we were supposed to conduct 2,100 interviews in 7 countries. It has not been possible to do this in Tanzania. In Greece, the survey is not completed yet, but we hope by the end that we will have around 1,800 interviews that have been completed. And the survey includes different sections, sort of the normal sort of personal information on the respondents, and then different sections focusing, for instance, on the journeys, the trajectories, and the reasons why people have been displaced, on questions of, you know, marginalization, social marginalization, and protractedness. Particular focus on connectivity, on the role of local, translocal networks, and how people get or give support to others, for instance. And due to the COVID situations, we also adapted parts of the survey, included a section on the COVID-19 situation. So currently, sort of with the help of the survey findings, we will then try to also address our central hypothesis of our project, sort of where we try to see where are the links sort of between the connectivity and mobility of displaced people and their situation of protracted displacement. If you allow me 2 more minutes, I can give you just a very quick snapshot on some of the initial findings, and also which will give you an impression how we will do comparison of our findings. For instance, we asked the people sort of whether they have people who are very important for them, whether some of them currently live in other places than there. And in Ethiopia, for instance, more people who were living out of the camps in the towns like Mekele or Addis Ababa answered these questions and said, yes, we have people living outside another place, and those who are living in camp settings also, most of them declined these questions. So we see that the network relations that people have, here the Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, they differ from one another. And so for those who are living outside of camps, here around 60% of them have transnational connections. They have members of their family, relatives, friends who live in other countries, and those who are living in camps, they're not that transnationally embedded. So similarly, I won't go through it in detail. We have the same findings then, of course, from Jordan, where we can also see, okay, living in a camp or outside a camp is an independent variable here. And we also see a similar tendency here, so that those who are living outside of camps are much better transnationally embedded. What it means for the everyday lives of the people, and sort of whether these transnational network connections can help to improve the situations of those who had to flee, is then another question, of course, that cannot be answered simply by displaying such a graph. But still, it's interesting to see, sort of, once you look into, you know, the transnational network relations that have that people have, or so, yeah, that the whole situation is not so much framed and bound by the local conditions, but particularly also by their transnational relations. And here, just for example, the Eritrean refugees living in Ethiopia, they laid out that 24 countries had been mentioned as key as places where relatives or friends live, and for the Syrian refugees have been 23 countries, and the relations to the country of origin have been quite different. So this just as a snapshot, and we want to use this now in the next step of our synthesis based on the survey data to develop like indices, where we say, okay, we have based on a set of questions that we have, and in the survey we try to see, okay, protractedness or marginalization, and develop an indices for this, and try to develop an indices for mobility and the indices for transnational connectivity, and then try to relate these findings with one another, and also see which independent variables matter the most in this regard, whether this is country of origin, gender, what I showed is living inside or outside of camp. And then we hopefully come a bit closer to answering or finding questions. One last point for the, that's part of the...
we are a bit, out of our time. So can you wrap up? Thank you.
Yeah, that's the last point here. Sort of besides this quantitative approach towards trying to see what is the essence of our findings, sort of we also try to apply our conceptual frame, the figurations, and see which kind of typical translocal figurations of displacement we can actually identify, such as whether families had to flee together, or whether they had got separated from displacement yet were already reunited at one place, whether sort of families had to split, whether there were broken connections, ruptures in the connections between people, and so forth. And this will also be a basis for our comparison across different parts of the project. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. I mean, these are fascinating findings, but I mean, for the sake of time, sorry, I had to stop you a little bit because we have our third presenter waiting. So Marta Biwant Erdal from Peace Research Institute Oslo, and also from Mignex project, work package leader regarding the qualitative data collection in 25 research areas in 10 countries. So please, Marta, floor is yours. You have, now I should also give you maybe some 12 minutes if you need to, because others took it. And then we will actually open up for discussion. And for our audience, please feel free to write down your questions already in the Q&A box, because we will address them later on. So thank you, Marta, for your patience. Go ahead, please.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Leah and Ben, for really exciting presentations already. I have a lot of questions and thoughts already, but I think I'll remember what I was supposed to present about. So thanks for this opportunity. I think this question about comparability in research on migration is very timely and very necessary, and I look forward also to the discussion. So I'd like to encourage us to reflect on 3 questions here, and I'll discuss this based on the Mignex project setup and our experiences so far. And we are grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic and in the midst of field work still. So I won't be presenting any results as such, but we have had some experiences still. So the three questions I'd like to focus on are first, unit of analysis, who or where, and I'll touch a little bit on issues of methodological nationalism. And then the question of comparison with qualitative data. What are the opportunities and obstacles and how we've approached that in the Migrants project? And then I'll actually take a step back and encourage us a little bit to think about why are we actually wanting to compare in migration research. Okay, so as Aishan has already mentioned, in the Migrants project, we are operating with these 25 research areas, and you can see them on this map here. I won't read them all out to you. And you can see that there are some yellow dots as well, and these basically mark where we have already conducted either the qualitative data collection or the quantitative survey data collection, or in some cases both. And as you can see, we are still waiting to conduct some of our research in the dots that are orange now in the summer of 2021, pandemic permitting. So the question of units of analysis, the Migrants research areas are subnational units of analysis, where most of our data collection is collected. We also do a bit of policy analysis at the national level, but I won't really discuss that today. So these can be a town, a part of a city, or a rural district. And the use of research areas reflects the overall emphasis in Migrants on disaggregation in the study of migration and development connections. And the population of this research areas varies quite a bit. They can be from 10,000 people to up to 100,000 people, and they're demarcated geographically in our approach. So they can be quite diverse in terms of the socioeconomic conditions that we find within them, but still our idea is that people who live there will have some similar experiences of some specific developments which mark these areas and which the survey data and qualitative data will help us shed light on. So then touching on the issue of cross-national research in this context. So of course, these places are not loosely somewhere on a map. They are of course within specific nation states. So we are doing research in 10 countries, and all of these countries are similar to the other projects that have been mentioned here already, focusing to some extent on migration to Europe, right? So these are contexts where there is emigration to Europe, but not only. And some of these are more marked by emigration and some are more marked by transit. And they are also places of immigration and of internal migration as well, of course. So in all these areas, we're conducting both the qualitative fieldwork and survey data collection, but I'll focus mainly on the qualitative data collection in this presentation. So there is a question there of comparing who or where. And importantly, in the Migrants context, we're comparing the dynamics within these areas as geographic units of analysis. So that is our approach. But within this as well, we are focusing on a specific demographic. So we're focusing in the focus group that we conduct, but actually also in the survey data collection on people who are aged 18 to 39 within these areas. So it's also a specific demographic. And we try to map, measure, and explore their diverse relations to migration so that we can understand the interplay of these relations with development processes in different ways in these specific areas. I think for migration research overall, it often remains a challenge that we're focused on the who, so very often on the migrants, and sometimes there's insufficient attention to the where, so where this is actually happening. I think there's an increasing attention to that in many migration research projects, thankfully, today. And in the Migrants project, we're trying to relate to this specifically in relation to decentering migration in studying relationships between migration and development. And I think this question of decentering migrants or migration is something that we know quite well. Of course, the question of methodological nationalism is by now very, very well rehearsed, and the articles by Andreas Wimmer and Benedikt Schiller are much cited. But still, I think we could probably agree that we haven't really found the perfect tools to actually do this. So nation states are so pervasive and they matter so much to our research in so many ways. So how do we balance that on taking in the way that nation states and borders really matter, but not really allowing that to methodologically or conceptually define entirely what we do? And this, of course, also matters in our Migrants research in different ways. And we hope that our approach will maybe offer some new tools in terms of how we can do this methodologically as well. So then moving on to the question of comparison with qualitative data. So in the Migrants project, we have different types of qualitative data. We're using mainly observation and photography, key informal interviews, and focus groups. And for those who are interested, we have a handbook chapter that's available on our website that you can download with our whole methodology. And of course, for each of these different data types that I mentioned, there would be a whole host of different challenges in terms of comparison. And I won't go into all of these in detail, but we could discuss that also in the discussion later. And of course, I should also point out that there are differences in types of data that you want to collect, that depend on your discipline, right? So I'm a geographer, I'm speaking from that perspective. If I was an anthropologist or a sociologist, maybe I would touch on these things in somewhat different ways. And I think we need to have disciplinary sensitivity, if you like, also in this context. Then we have in the Migrants project taken a very systematic approach also to qualitative data collection, or at least that's our aim and ambition. And you can see that in the handbook chapter as well. And we have a number of different types of checklists, which you can see also on the image here, that we try to use when conducting fieldwork, trying to sensitize us as researchers to the fact that we are trying to collect data in a systematic way, while still adhering to the principles of qualitative data collection, where of course we also need to be attuned to what is happening around us. So one way in which we've tried to do that is by developing tools that can enable or potentially enable comparison. And one of the things that we're doing is that in our focus groups that we conduct in each of the areas, where we have 4 focus groups, we use these visual tools. And you can see here images of different types of pathways that young people could opt for when leaving school in terms of livelihood pathways. And we use these same images across all the 25 areas. And of course, they have local iterations in a way, but we still use the same images in all of the areas. However, in order to sort of stay true to the fact that, of course, there are local differences, we also add a 9th option, which is something else that is also being discussed then in these focus groups, in terms of trying to place these things that might be very salient in some contexts, but could be different between the different contexts that we're looking at. So we're also in this way trying to, in a systematic way, capture heterogeneity. And all this we in a way do to be able to try to stage comparison at the level of analysis. And we do this also in the way that we report from the focus groups. So our goal is to record and transcribe all the focus groups in as far as that is possible in terms of ethics and these kinds of things. But we try to transcribe all of the focus groups. And in addition to the transcription, we also have these standardized forms that we try to fill out, basically where we ask all the researchers to explain how they have been using our standardized tools in their specific contexts. So one of the things that we do is that for each of the focus groups, we have 2 with men and 2 with women within this age bracket 18 to 39. We also have strong or weak migration ties. But of course, how that is operationalized will vary across these very different local contexts. But what we try to keep constant is that we have 2 focus groups with strong migration ties and 2 focus groups with weak migration ties. So that remains the same across all the areas. However, what that actually means specifically will vary between the different contexts. And so we ask researchers then to operationalize that and describe that in these forms. And then also to offer comments on how the methodology actually worked. So we'll be able to see afterwards, to what extent is it comparable in a way, and what are the challenges that we meet? And also in terms of having details about the participants, but avoiding to have personal data, of course, to be sensitive to that. So then to end, I'd like to sort of take a step back perhaps and reflect a little bit about why does comparison matter in migration research, and also in the context of MigNext specifically. I think we know that there are many benefits of comparative migration research, but it might be worth thinking more explicitly about which these are. And most of this I've pinched from different sources that I referenced here. So I think some of the merits of comparative migration research are about enabling understanding. So by being able to compare different units, compare different experiences, it enables better understanding of each one of them actually, as well as the whole. It facilitates awareness exactly because of the same thing. You realize that the phenomenon that you're seeing in one place can be understood somehow relative to what is going on somewhere else. It increases your awareness globally, as it were. It enhances the possibilities for generalization and thus also for theory development, which I think is a very important aspect of this. It also helps avoiding relativization or essentializing experiences, which again, I think we know is very important, especially in migration research. And perhaps also it sheds lights on alternatives, perhaps also in terms of policies and solutions and more on the ground realities of seeing how things are grappled with and tackled. I think these are 5 reasons why migration research can benefit from comparison, which of course doesn't mean that it's easy. And then we come to how do we actually do this? And here I certainly won't argue that I have all the answers, but there are some ways that we know that this has been done before. So of course, there are a number of discussions about case studies, which I think we're very familiar with. And these discussions, I think, are never ended, but there's always more to do there. And case study approaches also obviously have a lot to offer. And there is QCA, so qualitative comparative analysis, which we're engaging in MigNext as well, which is actually not just based on the qualitative data, but combining what we find out from all of our research areas based on the survey data and on the materials that we have from not just the focus groups, but all of our qualitative data across the different research areas. So we hope that we'll be able to say more about how that actually worked in a couple of years when we've finished it. But if you're interested, for now, two of our MigNext colleagues, Matthias Chaika and Marie Godin, have already published setup for this in Migration and Development earlier this year. So I'd like to just end on that question, and maybe that is something we can take forward in the discussion as well. So how do we do it, but also why is actually comparison important in migration research? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marta. It was really thought-provoking, and we had a very nice ending, in a way leading the way for the moderated Q&A, which is actually I will be reflecting on your presentations and putting some questions. Actually, I mean, your presentations paved the way for my questions. You already answered some part of it, but maybe we can elaborate more in this part of our webinar. Please, I mean, meanwhile, if there are questions from the audience, put them in the Q&A box, and then we will turn to it. So, for the sake of time, maybe I should list all the questions that I have in mind, and then turn back to our presenters. And then each of you will have 3-4 minutes to reflect. That means that you don't have to answer, of course, all the points, but I mean, you can maybe pick the most relevant one for you. So, I mean, I think that one of the good things about these large projects is that a lot of data collection process, a lot of the sort of the what's happening in between until we reach to the end point is actually also published in the sense of working papers, etc. Then we can actually follow the whole process. I think it's very promising for for anyone who's about to design a new project or who's reflecting on this research design issues. So, I mean, yeah, why we compare? I think this is sort of the overarching question, not only for migration studies, but also for other political science, sociology, historical sociology. This is a very important question. So, I mean, keep this question in mind, and then in this part, probably I will invite you. I mean, I invite you to reflect on this, but also you might think about the novelty in terms of your comparative approach, novelty of your comparative approach. How would you define it if you had to sort of highlight, one novelty? Because from the presentations, what I gathered is that, for instance, in the MAGIC, there is this like comparison of more like historical involvement, or maybe in some other case studies, one unit of analysis in a given time. In others, like sort of there is sort of the comparison also across time. So the unit of comparison stands out as an important, of course, conscious decision to take in those large projects. And how did you manage to come up with certain unit of analysis, but also at the same time, yeah, Marta mentioned the specific demographics, like the focusing on young people, focusing on displaced people only, or focusing the whole population. I think these are all very serious questions to reflect in the comparative design, which takes me to my second question, which is the unit of, not only like the unit of analysis, the level of analysis, but also like the population that we are researching. How do we select or target population in relation to policy categories versus in relation to more maybe a spatial approach, like we might focus all displaced people or even all population in those selected areas. And also, like, this is a question for everyone. How did you deal with the categorization regarding the policy categories that are, in a way, we are trying to avoid, but at the same time very much marking or academic work as well. So labor migrants, voluntary migrant, forced migrant, mixed flows, etc. How did you deal with all these policy categories that are sometimes becoming quite dominant? So this is the second one. The third one is really about, because you already mentioned this, but maybe we can elaborate more how we balance in these large projects the specificities of the local place, the locality that we are doing the research, and then the overarching standardization aim of this project as a whole. For instance, Marta mentioned, strong and weak migration ties. But I mean, what might be a strong migration tie in one context can be considered a weak tie in another context, where it is already quite marked by culture of migration. So this was only one example, but I really invite you to give some more concrete example. How did you manage to do that? For instance, when I think about Benjamin's presentation, yeah, I mean, being connected, less connected. Well, I mean, it might be quite contextual, right? How we assess like who's more connected than the others. And same for Leah's presentation, because he said, okay, we had to take into account the risks related to COVID, but also risks related to conflict situation. So how do you make this sort of, how do we still keep this standardization while we have to adapt to the context? So this is my third question. And finally, the fourth one, the impact of COVID. I think you mentioned this. This is related again to the previous one, and then maybe the one final question will be about the research relations in general. Relations with the local researchers, including translators, enumerators. How do we ensure that we collaborate, with the local partners, the very local ones, but also meeting the ethical standards of research, communicating with them regarding the requirements of the research, but also managing their expectations. And then this is possibly have become more challenging. Leah mentioned this in the context of the COVID context, where some of the field work had to be, conducted from afar, which required further collaboration, probably like more intense communication regarding how do we collaborate with the local actors. So these are all four not so easy questions, maybe. But I mean, please feel free to each of you, respond to any one of the questions that you think most relevant for your presentation. So let us have maybe, let me see, like 4 minutes for each. Would that work? And then should we go, who wants to go first? Should we go with the reverse order or the same order? I guess there's no preference. Marta, you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Aishan. I think, yeah, these are huge and very important questions, and I'm not going to even attempt trying to address all of them, but I'll touch on some of them. So I think I'd like to start with this issue of unit of analysis again, and sort of the what is it that we're actually comparing? Because I think maybe, if you think about our projects, if their only goal is comparison, it would be easy, but very often we want to do more than just comparing, right? So I think sometimes there are balances that need to be struck there. And I think in the context of Migrants, it was kind of from the outset very clear that the research areas as units were very important, because what we wanted to understand was how different types of developments, specific developments in an area, so the closure of schools or the establishment of a new university or a new industrial complex or a mine shutting down, so something quite specific which would affect the population, or at least the population in an area would know about and relate to, that was going to be an important parameter for understanding the migration dynamics. And that's kind of the lab in a way, where you try and see how policy maybe interacts with all of these things. And in that sense, then the unit of analysis was very clear. And I think then it also becomes easier in a way to compare it, at least in theory. We'll see how it works in practice, but at least in theory, because it's very clear that it's a geographic area in a way which is being compared. And of course, the people's impressions and experiences and considerations within that specific area. But I think in a way that makes it, the project is set up so that it makes comparison, hopefully, easier than if we had many other goals, I think, in the project. So I think the question of kind of unit of analysis and the research design are really, really importantly intertwined. And then in terms of the policy categories, I think in the Migrants project, we of course relate to this very much, and very much so also in parts of the project that are about policy more specifically, and also the European policy level. But I think in terms of the data collection, what's interesting is that, of course, because we're doing data collection outside of the EU, we're relating to local realities, where very often the EU policy categories are not the main ones, right? And they are, of course, known, but they are not necessarily the most relevant ones. And so I think reflecting on it also on the fieldwork that we did in Pakistan for Migrants, the reality is very much of other types of categories and not necessarily the policy categories that we think about perhaps in Europe, but it still becomes very important, because what is it actually that we mean when we speak about categories such as migration, or when we think about irregular migration, or if we think about migration which is legal and for contracted work, but it's to the Middle East, for instance. Or if we think about mobile populations in the area, these are categories that are relevant to the local population and to policymakers locally, but perhaps not really to the EU policy context. So I just wanted to share that reflection in terms of the fact that the policy categories also are quite multiple and of course viewed very differently from the outside of the EU very often than from within, I think, importantly. And finally, I wanted to pick up on this issue of the local specificity versus comparability. And I guess the sort of often, I think, idea that with qualitative research, it becomes impossible to compare because everything is so unique. And as a researcher who's done a lot of qualitative data, I in a sense have a sympathy for that. But at the same time, I also think it's sometimes a cop-out to say that, because we have to try to make things more comparable. Otherwise, they become very easily important stories of what's going on in a particular place with particular people. But they very often have more power analytically, I think, than that. And I think we should try to strive to get that out. But I think it is a challenge of how to do that because of exactly what you're saying, Aishan, and that in the Migrants project, if we're trying to understand in which ways an area in a way is characterized by people feeling more or less hope or more or less despair in terms of their future prospects in the area, that is something which is, of course, in context. It's in that specific context. And then it takes a bit of a sort of an intellectual leap in a way to try and compare that across contexts. But I think if you have these large-scale EU-funded projects with teams that are quite tightly knit, that are working closely together for a number of years, it is a unique possibility to actually do that. So I think it is possible. It is more a sort of methodological challenge for us, perhaps more than other things. But of course, the local and the unique has to somehow be encompassed and not be removed entirely. Otherwise, we lose the value of the data. So I think it's a balancing act, but I think it's one that we should dare to jump into at least. So I'll stop there and leave at least some of the points for my colleagues to comment on.
Thank you so much, Marta, for this insightful answer. Let us continue with Benjamin.
Yeah, I'm not so sure which point to address now among these many questions. Maybe I start as well with the question that Marta raised between the who and the where, which I find a very important one myself. And when we clearly see sort of in our project, this the question of the where, or so it has a very in different country settings or in different settings where people conducted research. This has different meaning for the people and different colleagues. Sort of in Germany, for instance, also we are sort of not so much focusing on the where at all, right? It's rather sort of about the who, right? And trying to understand from the perspective in Germany, okay, how do the people who came to Germany as refugees or who then applied for asylum here in Germany, how do they maintain transnational relations to friends, to relatives, or so who are living in other places. So and actually we didn't even try to see, okay, that where the locality in Germany also matters in this regard. Of course it matters, so, but as you can always do everything, so this was a particular choice. In other contexts, of course, we see, so it really depends a lot. Sort of, whether you, as I showed with some examples, whether you speak with displaced people who are living in a refugee camp or who are living in a city, whether there's this mobility out of camp is possible at all, what kind of cyclical mobilities people were somehow involved in. And then, of course, you see some also self-selectivity, right, of the people, sort of, depending where you conduct the kind of research that you do, you will get this particular kind of who. let's put it like this. So I think this is, and then there's sort of the where is actually very difficult. I think even more difficult to compare than the who. Sort of with this notion of these figurations and trying to set, okay, specific patterns, how transnational family networks, for instance, work. Okay, we can try to analyze and try to compare the situations across different places and across different countries. For instance, looking at families who have been together on the move, families who have been separated on the move, or people who said they have cut ties with their family members. I mean, you can try to see at least are there different similarities or difference in their respective experiences of displacement. I think these political categories, of course, that's a very important aspect as well. Simply choice for us was also okay that it had to be people who had been on the move, who had to be displaced at one point of a time, and then we left it. It was quite open to see, okay, the reasons why people see, and of course you have to acknowledge that there's always the mixed motives why people have been moving, and there's no clear cut, no binary answers in this regard with regard whether you're a refugee or a migrant. I think again coming back to the where, I mean, sort of the travel restrictions under the COVID pandemic also limited, I think, the opportunities for many of our researchers in the projects to discover more different places and to get a better sense of the place. For instance, we really had to cut down on ethnographic research in many localities and relied on different methods where we could not take sort of the locational aspects into account in the way that we had wished. Let's leave it at that.
Yes, thank you so much, Benjamin. Leah, please.
Thank you, Aishan, for really excellent questions. I don't think I will be able to answer all of them in 4 minutes, but I will give it a try. So first of all, your question about what is novel of our comparison, or why do we actually do what we do, or why do we compare? I think we reflected less on comparing, but how to compare, because our work package is on comparing as such. So it was clear from the very beginning that we are comparing. But what we have been doing is to design these case studies in a logic to nurture theoretical thinking, or to contribute to iterative theory building, maybe. So when we started to work as a team on this work package, we spent quite a lot of time on writing a conceptual framework where we, on the one hand, reviewed the literature and also formulated a series of hypotheses of what drives forced migration governance. And then we tried to identify gaps in the literature and overlooked cases, and also to understand what we could learn from historical cases about the present.
I think there's a connection problem, or is it just me? You also cannot hear Leah, right? Okay. Okay, let us see if she's, she will come back. All right. At this stage, I think, I mean, each project, as I see it, had to take really conscious decisions in terms of, what to compare and how to compare. And then all of these, in a way, large projects, of course, have this ambition of comparison, but it's also, yeah, as Marta mentioned, it's also kind of a matter of, working closely to achieve, this ambition, to make sure that, yeah, we are all on the same page, but at the same time, yeah, each context is it's different. So from what you said, I gather that, for instance, the sense that in traffic, yeah, you had the more standardized understanding of ties, right? Whether you have the tie or not, or Leah is back. And then in migrants, especially in the qualitative part, we had a different approach to what is a strong tie. Yes, Leah, welcome back. So here, I think it's also a matter of a difference between qualitative approach versus quantitative approach, which allows us to do like different ways of comparison. I think this is something to keep in mind. Sorry, Leah, we lost you for 1 second. Please finish your sentences, and then I will.
Sorry.
Q&A.
My internet connection is got interrupted. So what I was saying is that we did not work with a legal definition of refugees, as we followed, I think, other researchers and scholars who have criticized legal definitions of refugees as too narrow, and also maybe as too policy dependent, and also not so relevant in the context where we have been working, given that these categories do not necessarily make sense. And also, if we try to understand the purposive absence of policies and non-policies or informal practices as well, I think it's not, it didn't make sense to work with a legal definition of refugees as such. But what we did is to define what we mean with forced migration, defining it also on a continuum between voluntary and forced, and also between short and long term, between internal and external, and then to try and understand formal policies, laws, but also informal dynamics and laissez-faire targeting those people. So this was the way how we worked around policy categorizations. And I think, for example, in the case of Libyan displacement, this was very telling. For example, in expert interviews in Tunisia, displaced Libyans were never really framed as refugees as such, even if displaced Libyans would clearly also talk about interlinked drivers of their displacement, where one of them was clearly also forced. But this also relates, for example, also to the social class of displaced people. So and also a vulnerability and deservingness narrative on refugees. So can a rich Libyan in Tunisia actually be a refugee? Yes. And about COVID and local collaboration and working in a team from afar, for me this was very novel, because that's not what I normally do when I work in a team and also do field work. So it was for me very unusual also to do that. So there was a lot of informal communication via WhatsApp while data was collected, and also working at very different working hours. And I think interpersonal relations, of course, are very different from afar and virtually than if you really spend days together as a team in the field collecting data together. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these detailed answers. Actually, I have other questions, but I want to turn to the Q&A to our participants. So let me read the questions, because the attendees, as you know, the webinar format now may not see the question, but you can. In terms of the division of labor, please feel free to answer, whichever question that you find relevant for each research. I will go with one by one. So there is actually two questions asked together by one of the attendees. So one is about the sort of the avoiding studying nationalities. The person is saying that she was surprised not to see Palestinians displaced from Syria as an example of protracted displacements mentioned. and why exacerbates the assumption of exceptionality. So maybe this is something that might be more in relation to magic and traffic, more or maybe more magic than the others, but please free to answer. So this is potentially for Leah, but Benjamin can also say something. And then from the same person, to what's the what of comparisons seem to be missing, comparing state, regional, local practices and responses is very different to studying migration experiences. So most of the governance projects, of course, are trying to do both, like connecting these two. But this is probably something to think more. So there is more of a toolkit for comparing political legal responses than studying comparing experiences. Disciplinarity matters here too. So this is like more of a comment, which I actually, enlarged the question with my own comment. But basically, what I understand is that, yeah, the difference between studying and comparing experiences versus studying and comparing political, policy categories or legal responses, which potentially require different approaches. So maybe the first part is more for you, Leah, like the Palestinian refugees. And the second part is more or less for everyone, because all of these three projects are about governance.
Okay, so yes, thank you for mentioning also Palestinians who we also interviewed also for in the case of our case study. So yes, of course, Syrians or Palestinian Syrians who not necessarily have Syrian nationality but fled to Lebanon, for example, were part of people we talked to. And the second comment, the what of comparison seemed to be missing. So yes, I said we also focused on the lived experience of forced migrants, but what I meant with that is how forced migrants experienced governance and attempts to control mobility, and in this context. So we were comparing perspectives or experiences of policies and governance.
Maybe I can just quickly add to these two questions. With regard to Palestinians, I think that there was not a particular focus for the research in Jordan. Of course, I mean, of course, the Palestinians, that's the longest question of our situation of protracted displacement. But their particular focus was on the recent displacements. We had, of course, also had cases where there had been Palestinian Syrians or Syrian Palestinians or so who had been displaced and lived in Jordan and be interviewed, and same also in but also then in Greece and in Germany. But I can't give you a detailed answer now on what the particular findings were on this aspect. I think with regard to comparison of the what, comparing political strategies, policies, legal frameworks versus the migration experiences or the everyday lives of people, I think it's important to relate this kind of comparison to one another, right? So I mean, what we see and what is the key target also or key focus of traffic is that sort of that we see the classical so-called durable solutions that are often brought forward, to address protracted displacement situations, focus on return, on local integration, on third country solutions and resettlement and so forth, that they do not reflect the lived experiences of people who have been displaced and who are then find themselves in a protracted situation. They are place-based solutions. It's a question of, okay, you either go here, you either go there, or you stay here, and they do not reflect the networks in which people are embedded, and also the questions of circular mobilities, for instance, transnational lives, that emerge over time or are constructed over time. Then we see somehow that the migration experiences or the experiences of people who have been displaced, they're always in relation to the respective avenues that are brought forward. in conflict to them. Then be of interest to us, sort of based on what people actually do, based on their everyday lives, and to also propose alternatives, linking, for instance, at the moment to the whole discussion about complementary pathways out of protected displacement, and see what other avenues, you know, we propose to policymakers.
Thank you. Marta, you want to reflect maybe on the second part of the question, comparing what, policy versus experiences?
Sorry. Yeah, I guess I could, but I would actually also prefer to spend more time on some of the other questions that I'm seeing. So if you don't mind, I'll just pass. Sure. I think Lea and Ben already touched on many important parts here. Thanks.
Yes, I think most of the projects on governance are trying to do both basically, but there's also like the differences regarding the level of analysis, how we do the comparison, etc. Great. There is another question which might relate to also like all three projects. Given the rich data and number of countries migration research is taking place, what funding prospects do INGOs and multiple actors have in terms of civil society support at large? Of course, this is not something that we cannot necessarily answer because we're not on the funding side, but possibly on the type of collaboration that have been initiated. If you have any experiences or comments on this. And also the other question is also related to that. Maybe I ask them together. So the question after that is saying, related to the comparative research on migration, I wonder what you think about international research academic partnerships on migration. How do you see academic partnership might be possible in a balance between the global South and North perspectives, and how it will be efficient to produce knowledge on migration? So bringing these two questions together, I see that one is really about sort of the non-academic actors, you know, bringing in non-academic actors through different funding schemes that will be also potentially be useful for these institutions, but also for their beneficiaries. And the second question is more of a general, you know, power balance question regarding the global South, global North in relation to knowledge production on migration.
I can maybe start there, if that's okay, Aishan. So, yeah, like you say, there's a couple of different points, I think, that are within these questions. But I guess one way to start would be also just to acknowledge that there's a huge difference between contexts which are affected by some kind of humanitarian crisis, where there is an emergency, and especially where there isn't necessarily a state that is able to provide basic protection and shelter to the population that is there, whether they are citizens, residents or not. So I think that kind of humanitarian crisis situations where there is need for international assistance, as well as different types of local assistance, I think is in a way set a little bit apart. And for that, there are, of course, separate funding mechanisms, which yeah, I won't go more into detail, but I think it's just important to point out that there are exceptional circumstances, which unfortunately there are a lot of, and they are characterized a lot by displaced populations that are suffering. So I think that's kind of a conversation which is slightly maybe distinct from what I wanted to comment on, which is also about knowledge production, about migration more generally, where we know that most migration in the world is not crisis affected in that sort of serious kind of way, but is more normal in many parts of the world. And that most of that migration, of course, is not from the global South to the global North, but is within different types of regions within Asia or in Africa, or indeed within Latin America as well. So I think it's important, I think, in that context to have these global South perspectives that are very aware of that reality. And thankfully, because we're working together with colleagues in different countries, we also, as researchers in the global North, of course, know that. So I think maybe there is also an importance in trying to reflect on the value of perspectives of knowledge on what is going on in the global North and South, and that in a way, as researchers who are maybe based in or that are from one of these areas of the world, we are able to cross that boundary, so to speak. And I think that's also maybe important in terms of how we can work together also to produce good knowledge on migration, that even if I'm based in a global North institution, I can collaborate with colleagues in the global South and colleagues in the Global South can very often have very good perspectives on things that have to do with migration in the Global North or to the Global North as well. And that understanding and creating arenas for understanding and for sort of cooperating in knowledge production, I think is very important. And I think there are good examples of this in the projects that are represented here, but also in many other projects, thankfully, where we are seeing that. Now, having said that, of course, there are huge challenges because of the asymmetries in terms of access to mobility, in terms of access to resources, who can apply for different types of research funding. So there are huge issues here that are not easily resolved. But I think there are also examples of ways in which we can try to make some bridges and to try and collaborate in creating these types of knowledge on migration. And I do think related to that as well, that there are quite a lot of opportunities for funding also for other actors. But as Aishan said, of course, those would not be research funding mechanisms necessarily, but I think very often they are somehow tied together. And then sometimes it's also worth maybe not going for those types of funding as well that are very closely tied to policy goals. It depends completely on what type of civil society actions one is interested in pursuing, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I mean, regarding the South-South migration, you said like most of it's actually normal, but also some of it is actually in a way influenced by this transfer of crisis knowledge, which is, I think, Magic is dealing with, but also to a certain extent traffic. Leah or Benjamin, you wanna jump in here? Or maybe Marta covered.
I think from my part, Marta really covered mostly what I wanted to say. So
yes.
I don't feel I'm adding anything substantial to the discussion here.
Sure.
I mean, what I clearly see sort of from the experience in traffic now, it takes a lot of time to really build research relations, right? Across, also there has been a third question about interdisciplinary teams, and sort of we are working in different countries. We have different disciplinary backgrounds. We have a different philosophy of doing research, of being researchers. We have a certain positionality in the field ourselves. And it takes a lot of time and energy actually to build bridges first before you can actually start to do joint research. And I think a challenge of that we face in these kind of horizon projects that I perceive is that the time pressure that we're constantly under. Sort of, it's often assumed sort of you get the funding and wow, you can start straight away and everything works smoothly and perfectly or so. But you really have to build relationships and you have to build the relations with one another, so that actually you can also do research which is of a high quality in the end. And I think this is often disregarded. So I think for most, sort of also for future work, future consortia. So people work with people who they already know, right? So this is including some, but also excluding a lot of others. Because often within a very limited time and also actually then also a limited budget you have in these projects, it's sometimes difficult to include new partners and members. And as Marta said, sort of the power differentials, they're also there, and it's also asymmetric relations, and we have to reflect about that as well. And some of them we can try through the way how we work, we try to mitigate some. But others, they just continue to exist also due to the funding lines, which are funding our work.
Yes, great. Thank you so much for this insight. So there is actually one last question before we close the webinar, which is a general question related to interdisciplinarity. So I guess many of you work in interdisciplinary team. I would like to ask how you try to draw on the strength when also wanting to streamline data collection to make comparison easier. Maybe very briefly, like one minute each, to the who wants to reflect on this notion of, the level of interdisciplinarity that we have in our project.
Okay, I can give it a start. So in the work package 4 team, we are 5 people, and I think, yes, we all have different disciplinary backgrounds. So I have a background in political science and Arabic studies. Christiane Fröhlich has a background, I think, originally in English literature and conflict studies. Andre Bank in political science, and call here. I actually don't know. But so how do we work in an interdisciplinary way together? I think on the one hand, it enriches discussions on literature. So on the one hand, we have different backgrounds in what we read and how we think maybe about a certain question. And also methodologically, of course, we have very different experiences. Christiane, for example, has worked more with critical discourse analysis. I had experience also designing a survey before. Andre Bang, for example, has a huge experience of doing expert interviews. So I think when we discuss the research design and how we go about things, I think it's in a logic of collaboration and learning from each other.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Yeah, for us, I mean, sort of, I'm now in a phase in our project, sort of, where I try to bring research findings from qualitative research together with the quantitative findings. And there, of course, I rely a lot on the anthropological research that other colleagues have been doing. I mean, I can see certain tendencies, certain trends in the quantitative findings, and I can see, okay, this and that in the survey. But what I see doesn't mean that it makes sense, right? What I see, right? And it wouldn't be possible to interpret the data appropriately without the deep anthropological insights that other colleagues have gathered. For instance, Fekado Tufa in Ethiopia, or Fawaz Momani in Jordan, or others. Without this deep knowledge of the specific conditions at the places and the circumstances under which people live, would be impossible to make sense of the quantitative data at all.
So maybe just add to that, I think a sort of critical success factor, I think, is just a sort of a willingness to be part of an interdisciplinary team and not just sort of neighbors working alongside each other. And I think it really is more maybe about an attitude that if, whatever disciplines we have, that we actually want to build the knowledge cumulatively together, and that takes mostly all of us a little bit out of the comfort zone sometimes in terms of how we would do it if we were just working alone with people in our own discipline. And I think exactly what Ben also was mentioning with this kind of, it takes time, right? And I think this, to make interdisciplinary teamwork work well, especially across global north-south divides in addition, it takes quite a lot of time and commitment. And I think that's one of the interesting things with the pandemic, how we seem to maybe be managing to still continue to do this despite not being able to meet. And I think usually what I would have thought is that it is these workshops where we meet face to face and get to know each other, which are the sort of vehicles that make this possible. So hopefully that will be possible soon again. But I think that's really one of the things I've been worried about during this pandemic, because I think interdisciplinary collaboration it requires trust and openness and willing to go that extra mile. And so if we manage that, also working on Zoom and Teams, that's a very hopeful sign, I think, for interdisciplinary work as well.
Wonderful. So we answered actually all the questions. Let me see. Yes. I mean, this is also, our time is up. We are right on time. And I think we are also finishing on a hopeful note, both comparative research involving different contexts, but also involving researchers from different disciplines. I mean, they both require really building these trust relations, but also being open to new approaches and to new things, which is, I think, we are all trying to do. So thank you so much for your participation on behalf of the whole, webinar team and the Migrants team, which hosted this particular webinar. I thank our presenters, Marta Biwand Erdal, Benjamin Etzold, and Lea Müller-Funk, for their insights on this very challenging question of comparison in migration research. So that's it for today, and our webinars will continue on a monthly basis. So you may I think may like to sort of check the schedule for the future webinars. So that's it. I thank you so much for your participation, and also the attendees for your questions, for staying with us for this whole 1.5 hours. So I think we can end the webinar now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.